focus today will be on the importance of Torah learning. And the whole idea of, is there an elite class in Judaism? The answer is yes and no. That's the short answer. It's not on? Okay, whatever I said doesn't count because it wasn't recorded.
Oh, the witness protection program.
Is there an elite class in Judaism? The answer is yes and no. First we'll do the yes, and then we'll do the no. The yes is, and that's reflected in the Mishnah we're going to read. Second paragraph, paragraph 4 on this page. Yossi ben Ye'ezer ish tzreida v'Yossi ben kiblu mihem. The two Rabbi Yossis, one from the city of Tzreida and one from Jerusalem, received the tradition from them meaning the two names that were mentioned before, Antignos and Shimon HaTzadik. And they received the tradition from them. But from now on, it's no longer one rabbi transmitting the tradition, it's two. And the reason for that is that initially there was one head rabbi who was not just the leader of the Sanhedrin in terms of his rabbinic position, but he was also the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people. Even when the Jews had a king, they always had another leader who was a spiritual leader, but he was also involved in actually leading the Jewish people in other ways as well. But that split up into two, and that the Sanhedrin had two leaders to it. The top person was called the Nasi, the word that they use now for president, and the second in command was called the Av Bedin, the father or the head of the court. He was more internal, the Nasi was more external. Although they were both internal and external, each one focused on their own specialty. So the rabbis split up and they record the first dispute amongst rabbis we find with these two rabbis. And they from this time onward, more and more disputes would follow, up until the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Then they really started arguing. Then they were really serious about arguing. But what were they arguing about? They were arguing about Torah. And this is what the first Yossi says, that your house should be a house of meeting for the sages, and sit in the very dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst. So he's focusing on the central role of Torah teachers in Judaism. If you remember, Shimon HaTzadik says the world stands on three things: Torah, Avoda, which is prayer, and acts of kindness. Antignos focused on Avoda. When you serve your master, Avoda is serving, don't do it for the intent of getting reward. So he focused on that. This Yossi is focusing on Torah. He says you have to realize the preeminence of Torah study, that you have to try to always be in the company of people who are the elite, the spiritual Torah elite. And your house, and how do you do that? If you're not a Torah scholar yourself, how do you become influenced by these Torah scholars, these elite Torah scholars? Well, bring them into your home. Make sure your home is a meeting place for these sages. Or as some commentaries say, make sure that wherever they are, that's where you make your home. In other words, you'll always be in the presence of Torah scholars. Either way, it means be in their presence. But don't just be in their presence thinking, well, I'm a big guy. I have these great rabbis coming to my house, And you can start saying, I'm friendly with this rabbi and this great rabbi, and everyone's going to think you're also a great rabbi, and they're also part of the elite. No, when you sit before them, sit in the very dust of their feet. In other words, recognize that their status is above yours and sit in the dust of their feet. And some commentaries point out that it means you should follow them, and when people walk on the unpaved roads, the dust of the roads would fly up and you would bask in the dust of their feet. Either way, recognize that they are your senior, that they are superior, they are elite, and you should follow them. And not just do it because you're told to do it, but you should do it with gusto. You should drink their words with thirst. You should develop a thirst for knowledge. And this has been the hallmark of Judaism from day one. The Jews always had this thirst, this passion for Torah study. As one writer described the scene in a shtetl in Poland, or this could have been in Russia, or it could have been in Hungary, it could have been in many other countries in Europe, but this is the picture that he painted. You have a Jew, not a rabbi, not a scholar, a laborer, someone who works in a factory or some other type of trade or profession, leaves early in the morning after davening, works with his hands and sweats, a 12-hour shift, and now he's ready to call it a day. So what does he do? He goes to shul, to daven mincha, and then to study Talmud for an hour. And after that, he goes, davens Ma'ariv, and he goes home. Now imagine, this writer says, imagine this scene in a typical city somewhere in the Midwest. Someone's working in a steel, or in Buffalo, in Bethlehem Steel. Someone's working all day, sweating profusely, and the day is over, it's already 7 o'clock at night, after a 12-hour shift, goes to the library and reads Aristotle for an hour. How likely is that going to happen? Zero chances of that happening. Yes, if you're a professor of philosophy, you might want to study Aristotle at any time of the day or night because that's your profession. But the average person does not have this thirst for knowledge. It's very sad that the Jewish people, who are always distinguished themselves with this thirst and this passion for knowledge, what's been happening now is that that's being lost. I'm told that if I want people to not lose their attention span, make sure that the Dvar Torah is not longer than 10 seconds. Or else you'll lose the crowd. Present company excluded, obviously. But this is the new generation. 10 seconds, maybe we can handle. The lack of thirst for knowledge is tragic because this has been the hallmark of Jewish life for thousands of years. Jews always had this penchant, this obsession, this passion for learning Torah, and always looked up to the sages because they realized that that's where the knowledge is going to come from. When Rabbi Yosef, the great Talmudic sage, would celebrate Shavuot, he would say, this is a fantastic holiday. This was his favorite holiday. He said, if not for this day, his name was Joseph, there'd be many Joes in the marketplace. And he said, because of this day, I was elevated. This catapulted me to a different level. Torah elevates you to a different world. When you learn Torah, you're not on earth. You're in a different world. You're in God's world. And every Jew, whether he was able to put it into words, but it was understood. It was just something that came natural. The Jew knew he had to learn Torah. There's nothing more important than that. Yes. Yeah, Yossi is an Aramaic version of Yosef. Nowadays, Yossi became a nickname for Yosef, but in those days that was the proper name, Yosef. That was the name. Yeah, that's probably an Aramaic version of Yosef. Aramaic then was like the Yiddish today. It was the language that they spoke rather than Hebrew. Even though this was in Israel, they spoke Aramaic and Hebrew. They spoke both. Now, and so on one hand, the answer to the question is, yes, there is an elite. There's an elite class in Judaism. The rabbis were in that elite class. As I mentioned last week, the people did not look at the rabbis, as a general rule, as elitist. Though they were the elite, they were not elitist. They were very much part of the community. The rabbis were involved in the communal affairs. They related to the average person. They never felt that they were able to look down at anyone. Of course, there are always exceptions to every rule, but that was the general rule. But in spite of that, a rift did develop, even in Talmudic times, between the scholars and the lay people, to the point where the Talmud says that the Amaratzim is, we use that to mean ignoramuses, but in those days it meant people of the earth, materialistic people, would look at the rabbis with disdain. Rabbi Akiva, the greatest sage, the greatest rabbi of his time and of generations before and after, started learning to read Hebrew at the age of 40. Before that, he writes, I hated scholars. He had such contempt for scholars and for scholarship. So there was obviously a rift between the elite and the masses. But that was not the general rule. That was an exception. And also it could be it didn't happen in earlier times. It developed later after the destruction of the temple, which is reminiscent of what happened 300 years ago after the pogroms in the 17th century and the false messianic adventure of Shabtai Tzvi. The Jewish people were so crushed that most of the Jews could not really learn. They couldn't afford to give their children a Jewish education. So many of them were illiterate or barely literate, and certainly could not spend time studying the intricacies of the Talmud and so on. But the more fortunate ones, the elite, the scholars, did not behave the way the Talmudic counterparts behaved. They did look down at the other Jews. They looked down at the simple Jews with contempt, somehow rationalizing that the reason why they're poor and ignorant is because they're not really good people. They probably did so many sins that God is punishing them. They had this awful philosophy, and that's when the Baal Shem Tov came along and fought against that elitist position. So the truth of the matter is that, and this is true in every area of Judaism, you have to know what your challenge is. A rich person's challenge is to help the poor. A poor person's challenge is not to be envious of the rich. And what happens in society is it goes the other way around. The rich give to wealthy causes, and the poor are envious of the rich. And there's a class warfare that you have in society where everyone is condemning the people who have more. But Judaism says, no, if you have more, whatever it is, knowledge, material wealth, you have to share it with others. Vishinantam levanecha, you have to teach it to your children. And Rashi quotes the Midrash, the Talmud, these are your students. Every Jew is obligated to who has knowledge to impart that knowledge to others. You don't look down and say, why would I want to teach this ignorant person? That's why you have the knowledge. Why do you have to give charity to the poor? That's why God gave you the wealth. You think He gave you the wealth because He wants you to have an expensive car or an expensive house? He wants you to have the wealth so you can help the poor. Very good question. Very good question. So the question is asked by poor people. What? Right? It's a question that's mentioned in the Talmud. And the answer to that question is that in this world, if we wouldn't have haves and have-nots, no one would be able to do acts of kindness. If everyone has everything they need, materially and spiritually, then I would never have to help the other person would never have to help me, and we would just be, we would be bereft of the trait of kindness. In fact, Jews, Mashiach comes, we're going to have all our material needs, but that doesn't mean we can't help one another and influence one another spiritually, because there's no limit to spirituality. So we'll always be doing kindness to others. In the Soviet Union, it was looked down for you to help another person, because the government takes care of everything. So by you trying to help another person, that means you're speaking out against the government. You're casting aspersions on the government's role of making sure everyone has everything they need. And what happened as a result, that many people who went through the system of the Soviet Union lost their ability to be kind. And those who are kind in spite of that are really very noble people. You can relearn it. But Americans are much more kind than any country that has a socialistic bent to it. And the reason is very simple. If you believe in socialism, if you believe in that the government has to take care of people's needs, that means I don't have to take care of them. If someone comes to me and says, I need help, I said, why don't you get food stamps? I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with getting food stamps if you need it, but the first thing you should think of, how can I help you? If I can, then go to the government. But what happens in a socialist environment is that the government is supposed to take care of everything, so I don't have to take care, so I lose my ability. If you don't use your arm, God forbid, then you lose the ability to use your arm. You have to exercise every part of your body for it to function. You have to exercise your talent of kindness. So getting back to what I was saying before, so those who have the knowledge are not allowed to look down at those who don't have the knowledge. On the contrary, they have to say, God gave me the knowledge for one reason and one reason only, so I could help you and others get the knowledge that I have that you didn't get. And if I don't do that, I'm worse off having the knowledge than if I wouldn't have it. The simple Jew is superior to the scholar. That's what the Baal Shem Tov said, and the scholars didn't like it, but they thought he was trying to say that Torah learning is not important. That was not what he was saying. He was saying Torah learning is important if you don't use the Torah learning as a way to look down at others and withhold your knowledge from others. So the greatness of being an elite, having the elite, is that you don't keep it for yourself. Now, conversely, the poor person, poor physically, materially, spiritually, should never be jealous of the person who is rich and say, it's not fair that I have less than the other person. And you have to have respect for the person who has more in order to be able to receive from that person. So yes, there's an elite in Judaism, but it's never an elitist, never allowed to be an elitist type of attitude. There's an interesting story in the Torah that I'm sure everyone has heard of Korach. Korach, you know, there was a rabbi who had only one talk he can give on Korach. His hat, and he would look for his, he would swallow it up like, oh, speaking of Korach, let me, more about Korach. So speaking of Korach, Korach was the one who attacked Moses as an elitist. You know, why do you make yourself higher than everyone else? Everyone is holy, everyone is equal. He was guilty of not respecting the fact that Moses was on a higher level. Moses was chosen by God to give the Torah, to liberate them. And they should have recognized that. But he looked at it as Moshe was an elitist. But Moshe was the most humble person on the face of the earth. He wasn't an elitist at all. But it's interesting, there's a midrash that says something very strange about Korach. One of the things that Korach accused Moses of was adultery. Now, of all things to accuse Moses, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. What does that mean? Why would he accuse him of adultery? What did he do that can possibly lead to such an accusation? I mean, he could have said that Moses was a bank robber, for all we know. I mean, why did he pick on adultery? So this is one possible way of explaining it. The Talmud says that our relationship with the Torah is like a husband and a wife. We are like the husband. The Torah is our wife, our spouse. The Torah belongs to the Jewish people. We're married to it. But the problem is you can only have one husband. So what do? We have 15 million Jews. That means 50 million husbands? The answer is no. We're all one people. We're all one. It's one husband, one Jewish people. But if you think you're above everyone, and you're not part of the Jewish people, and you learn Torah, then that's adultery. Because you are not really part of the community. So the community is married to the Torah, so who gives you a right? You're not part of the community. And that's what they said about Moses. And Moses, you think you're better than everyone else. You're not part of the community. Of course, they were totally wrong. Moses was the community. Moses' relationship with the community was like the relationship of the brain to the rest of the body. Are we going to say to the brain, with a toenail, say to the brain, you elitist, what do you think you're better than me? I'm just as much a part of the human body as the brain is. So don't think you're so special, you brain, or the heart. And we're all equal. That was Korach's argument. And that's foolish. Moses was not equal, but he was the essence of the Jewish community. When a Torah scholar, when someone who learns Torah recognizes that, yes, this is the elite, but the elite means that I am part of the Jewish community, because if I'm not part, I have no right to it. It's not mine. It wasn't intended for me. It was intended for the people, not for the elitist. So when an elitist thinks he's better than everyone else and looks down at everyone, he's guilty of adultery. In a very subtle way, of course. And it's very unbecoming. So the lesson over here is, as we come to the holiday of Shavuos, is that we have to develop this passion to learn Torah, to learn more and more. Even though women are not given the same degree of obligation as men, it's a mistake to think that women do not have an obligation to study Torah. Because there are two aspects of Torah study. One is study of Torah as a separate, independent discipline. Theoretical knowledge. We can learn parts of Torah that have no bearing on our lives. For example, the Torah talks about the case of a rebellious child who has to be executed. And the Talmud says it never happened and never will happen. So then why are we studying it? Because the Torah wants us just to study God's wisdom. And it's pure theoretical. It's to scare the kid, yes. That's also true. But there are a lot of things in the Torah that we learn that we cannot practice, but yet it's still part of Torah study. But then there's the part of Torah study that is practical, that has to be applied. There's theoretical physics and there's applied physics. There's theoretical Torah and there's applied Torah. So we have both disciplines. Men are obligated to spend their time studying theoretical knowledge in addition to the practical. Women have to put the greater emphasis on the practical side of Torah. It just so happens that women are much more down to earth than men. I think the women will agree with me. The men might not agree, but the women will agree. They're much more in tune with reality. Abraham and Sarah. What does God tell Abraham?
Listen to your wife.
Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, because she's a greater prophet than you are. What does that mean, greater prophet? Prophecy is the ability to take the spiritual world and make it applicable in the physical world. If you can't relate, if you're in the clouds and you're a great prophet, but you can't relate it to the physical, then your prophecy is not really helping anyone. So Sarah had a much greater ability to translate the values, the ideals, the theories into practice. That's next week, and I'm leaving the country. No, I'm not afraid to tackle the next one either. I think it's the opposite of what most people think it means. But, I'll keep you in suspense. I know you'll come next week. So women's obligation to study Torah is the practical ones. Now, what does practical mean? Of the 613 commandments, although most of them we can't do today because we don't have the temple, but of most of the commandments, men and women have equally. There's a misrepresentation. I once had a student who wrote a paper, and he was given the information by a rabbi, a Reform rabbi, who's no longer in town. And this Reform rabbi said that women only have 3 mitzvahs. Men have 613, women have 3. Which is the most ridiculous thing. Women have, of the 613, about 600, and the 3 of those mitzvahs women share with men, but women have a much greater role in those 3. So it's not that women have 3 mitzvahs, they have 3 mitzvahs above and beyond that which the men have, because they have a much greater emphasis. But that's a subject for another. Lighting Shabbos candles and holiday candles, and mikveh, and challah, taking challah. Which in a broad sense means overseeing the kashrus. What? So women have to study Torah that relates to all of the mitzvahs. And when they finish mastering all of there is to know about all of the mitzvahs, then they don't have to learn anymore. But that's more than one lifetime of learning. In the olden days, it's true that in Europe, women did not get a Jewish education, because in those days, economically, you couldn't afford to have everyone studying Torah, because you had to take care of the family, the home, the farm, and whatever else. And women picked up the practical knowledge by osmosis. They knew more about kashrus than the rabbi who they went to ask questions. When they would go to the rabbi to ask a question about a chicken, the rabbi looked at it and he said, well, if this is what the chicken is, if this is the part of the chicken, if this is what it's called, then it's kosher. If this is what it's called, he didn't know what a chicken looked like. He just knew the theory. And the woman would tell Rabbi, this is what it is. So the women sometimes knew more than the rabbis, even though they were not steeped in the knowledge itself. But they picked it up by osmosis. But anyhow, women do have to learn Torah. But when the goal of Shavuos is to recognize that Torah is the supreme value in Judaism. Now, if you learn Torah and you don't apply it and you don't practice what it says, then you're casting aspersions on the Torah. You're saying that Torah doesn't really work. It doesn't affect you. Another thing about Torah is that Torah is God's way of thinking. Our way of thinking is based on many factors: parents, friends, teachers, environment, media, which is probably the most significant influence in a person's life, because how many hours do teenagers listen to their parents, and how many hours do they listen to their peers and the internet? They don't go on Facebook anymore. They go on Instagram, on Twitter. Okay, but most people, and in the olden days it was television and movies. Most people are influenced by all sorts of influences. Some of them are positive, most are not positive. So what happens is that our whole way of thinking becomes twisted, and we don't think Jewishly. There was once there was a rabbi who wrote a book, and the book says, "Speak English, but think Jewish." You could speak any language you want. English is no worse than any other language. But start to think Jewishly. And how do you develop a Jewish way of thinking? By learning Torah. Torah is God's wisdom. So when you saturate your mind with God's wisdom, it gives you the ability to think in a godly way. The more you study, the more your mind starts to work in a certain way. And that's why one is supposed to listen to the rabbi, even if the layperson is a scholar. For example, I know synagogues where most of the members are rabbis, but not by the rabbis by degree, but they earn a living by working. Unlike rabbis. I mean, they work, they're lawyers, doctors, accountants, business people, but they all have smicha, and they're knowledgeable people. but they still have to defer to the rabbi who may not know as much as them. At least he doesn't know as much as the collective body of all those members, but because that's his preoccupation, his mind is not affected and influenced by secular values and secular ideas that come from every direction. Some of them could be good and harmless, and a lot of them are not harmless. So that's why so the rabbi doesn't have the authority because he's better than everyone, but it's just because he has, hopefully, if where the rabbis do what they're supposed to be doing, he has the knowledge of Torah, and he's steeped in the knowledge of Torah. And Yossi ben Yoezer is encouraging everyone to try to absorb as much as you can from those rabbis, not just by learning formally, but just by being with them and picking up the attitudes of those rabbis. The Talmud says, Gedayla shimusha yosem elimuda, serving the rabbi, in other words, being in the rabbi's home and observing the way he behaves and so on and so forth, you learn more than if you actually study under him. And the proof of that is when the Tanakh describes Elisha, the prophet Elisha, who was a student of Eliyahu, Elisha and Eliyahu, it says, Sheyatzak mayim al yedei Eliyahu. He poured water when he was together with Elijah. He was a water carrier. That means he worked for him. Why doesn't it say he studied under him? Because you learn more from a person's behavior than just by hearing a lecture. So that's why Yosef ben Yoezer was saying it's not enough just to study Torah under the sages. Take a course in university for a professor, that's enough. You take a course, you don't even have to see the professor. You can go online, you could hear the lecture, and you can get a degree, and there's nothing more that you have to have in terms of your relationship. When it comes to Torah, you need to have a personal relationship with the source of that knowledge. And that's what Yosef ben Yoezer was advocating. Any questions?
Is that where Seder came from?
Seder?
You know, in yeshivas, the boys, they do Seders. There's somebody there as well.
Well, there's always someone there to ask questions, besides giving classes.
No. The study.
Seder means the order. That means the chavrusa, the study partner. That's a separate thing. Besides having a teacher, we'll later learn, you also have to have a chavrusa, a colleague, a friend with whom to discuss matters of Torah and other matters as well. Right? Why not? It's a degree. If someone has a PhD but is not a professor, would you call him? Would you take away his PhD from him? No. It's an honorific title, but you wouldn't use him as your source of practical knowledge. In other words, if you have a question in Jewish law, obviously if there's no one else around, you'd go to him because he has the knowledge, but you'd go to someone who's primarily involved with Torah and not with other areas, as great as they are and as wonderful as they are. Right. Yes. It depends on them. If they feel slighted, then you shouldn't. If they feel offended, if they're insulted, then you should call them rabbi. But they probably don't mind. There's an expression, "Ritzono shel adam zehu kvodo." The will of a person is his honor. If the person doesn't want to be called by an honorific title, then that's his honor. You just can't use a nasty name for even if he doesn't mind. Yeah.
Just to follow up what Ellie was talking about, and then I wanted to bring something else up. When you go to the cemetery and you look at the names, Bat Rev, Ben Rev, the Reish.
Right.
You see that, and they weren't rabbis, but they make that as
right. It's customary in the Jewish community. When you call someone up to the Torah,
no, but it still says. Yeah.
You call him Reb.
Right.
Reb. It's short for rabbi, but he's not a rabbi. He's a layperson. But it's a way. It's like Mister today. Mr. is an honorific way of referring to someone. Well, that's how it was done.
The other thing I want to bring up, and help me out with this, I remember somewhere learning about the lulav and how it represents Kalal Yisrael, the different parts of the lulav,
Right.
but they're all together, the different types of Jews that learn.
Right.
One does this, but doesn't do that. One does that,
Right.
but doesn't do
The
this.
four kinds represent four classes.
Yeah.
The etrog has fragrance and taste. Taste is knowledge, fragrance is good deeds. The lulav is a date palm. Dates have taste but no fragrance. The myrtle has fragrance, no taste. The willow has neither. So which one is the most perfect one? The etrog. Yet we make the blessing on the lulav. The lulav is the more dominant one. The lulav represents the Torah scholar. So even though the etrog is superior, it has knowledge and good deeds, he has to defer to the one who has the knowledge. And again, we're not talking about someone who has no good deeds. Obviously, that person is a rogue scholar. But someone who's not, that's not his specialty. I mean, you take the greatest halachic authorities in the world. Moshe Feinstein, let's say. Moshe Feinstein was... Right. They were very kind people, but that was not what they were doing all day long. All day long, 95% of the time, they were studying, teaching, and answering questions of Jewish law. So you would defer to a person like that than to some of their students that split their day into both, doing half and half. So it doesn't mean that the lulav is superior, it just means that the lulav is someone whose mind is totally steeped in Torah and therefore has the ability to see things clearly from a Torah perspective. And that's really the goal, to see things from a Torah perspective. Because most people, again, society is, in the last 10 years, society has shifted 180 degrees in so many different areas. I'm not going to go into the different areas. The society has shifted. Things that were considered to be normal and positive are considered to be evil and hateful today. And the same people who said those were normal and positive are now calling people haters for having a different view today. Things are changing. But Judaism doesn't change its values. People change, but Judaism does not change. So we have to be able to see things through the prism of Judaism, of Torah, rather than looking on the internet, looking in the media to find out what our values should be. Yes? What was the question?
You said things that years ago were acceptable, were acceptable or not acceptable. And I'm saying things years ago were not acceptable.
Yes, it goes. Yeah. I'm not arguing. I'm saying there are values that existed 10, 20, 30 years ago that are no longer considered values, and things that were considered to be wrong then are now considered to be right. I mean, it goes in both directions. Society is evolving and changing, or devolving and changing.
Just real quick, reiteration. Did you say that when you look at the Torah, it's the way how they speak things? Torah's the way
Right.
that
It's like picking God's mind. That's one very down-to-earth way of putting it. You want to see how He thinks about things. And God, in His infinite kindness, allowed us to get a glimpse of His thoughts. God's thoughts are beyond human beings' ability to comprehend. But in His infinite kindness, God says, I want to give you the ability to grasp some of what my mindset is like. Okay?
Yeah. Lean into it.
Rabbi Mike. Right, because the lulav is the dominant one. The simple reason is it's the tallest, and it has the other two leaves attached to it, whereas the etrog stands by itself. But it's also because the lulav symbolizes the one whose life is completely revolves around and is immersed in Torah. And that's the person. That's the person or the that has to can give instructions to all the other classes, because that person sees things not through his own personal prism, but through God's prism.
Put it simply put, action speaks louder than words. In a lot of cases.
That's definitely true.
That's no question about it.
Okay, class.